Okay. This is an experience I've had for a long time. It's also an experience I've struggled with for a very long time. I know that it happens specifically when the camera is in my hand, though it has in part happened at other times. I don't feel at home anywhere in the universe, but there are places where I feel profoundly connected. Old Sheldon Church is one of those. Uncharacteristically, the chapel at Yale was one of those places, specifically when I was there with Sally. When this incident or event that is recorded in this essay happened, it was the first time I've ever experienced this stillness. So this past weekend, I was down in Savannah with family, my son, who's my business partner. We decided we would continue to do some experimentation with film. We started out at Bonaventure Cemetery, which is a famous cemetery in Savannah, a place I enjoy going, especially to experiment, but not a place that I'm particularly connected to. We planned as soon as the rain stopped to head about 45 minutes away to Old Sheldon Church. There is a tree on the right side of the church, bent, very much arc-like. For whatever reason, that is a connection point for me. So we got out of the car. I put my camera bag on a bench, and as I picked the camera up, I could feel myself begin to drift into the moment. So 15, 20 minutes or more into it, I texted Julia, filthy, sweaty, mosquito bitten, covered in dirt, and it couldn't be better. And by that point, I am so connected that I'm disconnected. I'm there, I'm not there. And at one point, later in the essay, I said, "This is stillness. And one day, I would like to explain what I call stillness to you." And the response I got back, "Is that the state that allows you to see most vividly?" Yes. Time seems to stop, or past, present, and future are simultaneously here, as though folded over itself, and I seem to disappear into the moment, into the bark of the tree, the mortar of the brick, the green of the grass. And at that point, in a way that I'm not sure there will ever be words to describe, I am not there, but I am absolutely everywhere, connected to everything, as though absorbed. So let me stop there. Questions so far? So part of what kept coming up, which we've talked about in part in the past, is the potential relationship between what I'm calling stillness and what Heidegger calls poetic dwelling. But there's also that connection back to Nietzsche, to some extent, to his conversation about the eternal recurrence of the same. He describes it as standing at a crossroads. where the present is inseparable from past and future. But stillness is even deeper than that. It is in some way when there is an organic connection between past, present, and future. It is somehow tied to memory, but it isn't just memory. For example, every time I walk down Spring Street in New York between Broadway and Soho, every time that I've been there with every woman I've ever been there with, I can see them all there at the same time, and I am there in all those moments, as though somehow it has all come together. Or in the case of Sally, in the chapel at Yale, being able to experience not being in the chapel with at Yale with Sally, even though I was there. So it seems to me that what Heidegger called measuring is in some way a deeper and more profound experience. It may be in part related to the distinction between time and temporality, where if time is the linear logical construct, temporality, which we have mentioned in a past lecture, is the taking of the measure. There are several things in that essay, or several aspects of that essay, that are completely new. So if we look at those, the first is, I have always been alone in those moments, which doesn't mean that people are not aware. A number of years ago, I was working with a model, and she got very upset with me. And eventually, she said to me, "Where are you? You're not paying attention to me." And my comment was, "I'm in the shadow falling across the floor. I'm in the folds of your dress." And what she had witnessed was my being in the stillness, but I was there alone. What was particularly interesting in ways I haven't begun to understand, Julia was there. At one point, I was standing facing the church, the tree between me and the church, and I literally could feel her standing next to me. So that has caused me to begin to rethink the nature of stillness, the nature of temporality, the nature of creativity. Example, I am my most creative when I am in the stillness. In the stillness, there is the sense that there is no sound, there is no time, there is, in Heideggerian terms, nothing. We've talked about other aspects of this when we've talked about in-betweenness. I am clearly there. I am clearly taking the measure. I am clearly in between earth and sky. But there's a sense in which I'm not there. At one point, I commented to Julia that I could see that there were mosquito bites all over my hands, but I couldn't feel the mosquito bites. I know when we were on assignment in Honduras and I broke my ribs, I couldn't feel my broken ribs until we got back to the hotel. Whatever this moment is that I am calling stillness, the word that Julia used is that in some sense, it is a kind of transcendence. Again, I'm not sure that's a word I would use. It's almost as though I have somehow stepped out of time or stepped away. Questions, thoughts? I know this is difficult, and I can only imagine your reaction to the essay. I can assure you that when I read it, it was pretty much what you would experience thinking about it.
Who's Julia?
Okay, Julia is someone that I know. We're sort of communicating back and forth. There is not anything that approaches a relationship. I guess you would say casual friends at the moment. Her father was a photographer. And so one of the connection points between us is photography, creativity. And knowing that, I decided to share with her the image of the church. And it's not like me to communicate. Typically, when I'm in this place, I stop. I'm silent. I wasn't just communicating with her. My son wanted to discuss some technical issues. He's still relatively new to working with film. And part of what I find interesting and perplexing is that throughout this experience, I stayed in communication with him, which I ordinarily would not have done. I either wouldn't have responded or I would have dropped out of the stillness. So this was a unique experience on multiple fronts. Does that help answer your question?
Slightly.
Okay, how about if we try it this way? What did you find most interesting or perplexing about that essay before I go further? Other than the fact that you may not have ever experienced anything like that.
Would you say that stillness in some way is kind of like straight line? Or would you say, because you said that if I can step away from time, then, okay, never mind. I wouldn't say state of mind. I would say, well, I guess my question is, like, what part of you has stepped away, if that makes sense? Because physically you can't step away from time. So, because our bodies are always in motion time. So would you say that it's like, it's your mind, your thinking, your senses, like all of that has stepped away from time? Or maybe just like your brain, like, what part of you do you feel like has stepped away?
That's a great question. Let's see if I can tell you a little bit more about the experience. There are times when I can feel it coming. For example, if I'm going to sit down to write a poem, there is a kind of intellectual process I can go through where I put the writing of that poem somewhere in my head and I let it go. When I come back to it, I am so caught up into the experience of that the outside world disappears. It's me, my computer, and what I'm writing. When the camera is in my hand, it's different. Um, at one point, texting back and forth with Julia, I walked up to that tree and I put my hand back on the bark. I could clearly feel the bark, but I wasn't sure specifically how my hand was touching the bark. Or when I finished and we decided we were going to head back to Savannah, I was just sitting on the bench next to my camera bag and someone said, "Are you okay?" And I said, "I'm not here. I'm quite fine, but I'm not here." And proceeded to get up and walk around the church and lay my hands on the tree. And it was also particularly interesting. Typically, when these moments happen, um, when I leave, they're gone. But the next day, when I wrote the essay and sent it off to Julia, um, that was there was a part of me that was still very clearly there. I can feel it in my hands first. I can feel it in the way that it changes my interaction with the camera. Um, Ironically, I have never attached to a camera before, but this camera, which was made around 1981, there is a clear connection between me and that camera. So I'm sure some of it is my eyes. Um, I think I know what you look like, but probably the only way I can be sure would be to actually touch your face at this point. When I'm driving, I don't have that problem. I'm very clearly seeing. But in the bulk of my life, whatever this is has coupled with my eye problems, has caused me to shift. So if I were to ask myself, what is it that I perceive first? I perceive emotion, not objects. And as I'm explaining this to you, part of what is intriguing is I want to come back to Kant briefly before we're done. But generally, in that transition into stillness, I can feel my connection to the world is changing. I'm perceiving things at some level that I otherwise can't. Someone said to me the other day, "Oh, you saw that?" And then she looked at me and she said, "You don't miss anything, do you?" And my comment to myself, rather than to talk about this, was to say, given the way that I'm connecting to the world, I have to see things that others don't because I'm not connecting in the same way. Does that make sense? Sure.
Because you said you see emotions are rather than objects. I'm sorry, because I just find this very interesting. So, because you perceive emotions rather than objects, do you feel like when you have these kinds of stillness because you connect with the world differently than others, like in a more emotional like when you have your moment of stillness, you essentially deeper connect into the emotions that make you feel a sense of aloneness so that you can deeper connect to it.
Yes, you're right. With the exception of this past weekend and the experience with Julia, the more still the world becomes, the more alone I am. We subsequently had a conversation. Her favorite flower is the peony. The only way that I'm going to be able to see the peony is to hold it in my hand. The same thing is true. In my world, the equivalent of a peony is an orchid. I literally, my favorite ones are a deep purple. This morning, I literally had to put my hands on the orchid because purple is not visual to me. Purple is an emotional experience. So increasingly, with my eyes, I'm being forced to encounter the world differently. I can't tell whether these are in some respects a change in my wiring, or I only know that most of the time when I walk through the student center here, I am not looking, I'm feeling, I'm picking up things. To go back to your original point, yes, absolutely. There are times when that sense of being alone is absolutely harrowing. But at the same time that I'm alone, I'm also incredibly deeply connected. The bark on that tree is not the same when I'm not still. Please ask all kinds of questions. I'm attempting to think through something.
So when you have stillness, like this is more than literal thing, but do you still think like you regularly do when you're not still? Or is your train of thought also more steady and not hardened after immediately?
I don't in the least bit think logically. One of the interesting parts, again, looking back over the last decade, when I teach photography, I stress the importance of ritual. And the ritual is, how do I set up my camera? And I do that because most humans have a choice. They can think or they can emotionally feel. And if you define a photograph as a visual invitation to an emotional experience, then by definition, I have to focus on the feeling, not on the thinking. So I have a series of questions that I asked myself, which are designed to get rid of the thinking part. So if you want to think about the ritual as a kind of preparation for stillness, that would be a good way to think about it. My son made an interesting comment that one of the things that we do when we're shooting film is we record the settings because digital images have a technology called EXIF. So when I look at a digital image, all of the camera settings are recorded, but that's not true in film. So we have a program we use on our phones, basically a notepad type thing. And my son was noting that it's really difficult for him, being new to film, to both be in the moment and do that. And that was particularly interesting because while I haven't shot a million rolls of film, that's not an issue for me anymore. Is this helpful? So, talking to you about it, there is a sense in which I know I can create it. If I can't create it, I'm engendering it, or at least creating an environment in which that's possible. Um, Obviously, because of the nature of my eyes, I'm forced to rely on my emotions anyway, much more so. And you've both been students in my class, and you know that I'm constantly reading the emotions of my students. So stillness is sort of a fundamental, organic, primordial connection that's far deeper than simply the experience itself. Other questions or thoughts so far?
My questions are more technical. Is
Mm-hmm.
there any reason why you use the Y instead of the I in night and winter?
Old English.
And then why you capitalize anything that has to do with yourself?
That has to do with being golf.
And then why Julia and not Sally?
Sally is long gone out of my life.
I mean, sure,
Um,
but when you connect yourself to moments.
if I could find Sally, I would. I have, let's try it this way. Um, my dark sister, I can feel where she is all the time. And when she, quote, disappears off the grid, I know it. So I am capable of maintaining those connections. I don't know where Sally is, and I haven't felt Sally in a very long time. But the reason I started out with that story was because that was the first time I experienced this folding of time over on itself. And in part, I guess I never realized it until this trip to Old Sheldon Church. And when the time folded back over itself, I was back in the chapel at Yale standing next to Sally. And that's part of the stillness is I don't know where the connections will fall or how the connections will come together. Some of it, if you think about a conversation we had in philosophy, we said that one of the fundamental differences about humans is our ability to embed emotion in an object. Well, we can also embed emotion in place. And sometimes we can connect those two. If you remember back to philosophy, I talked about that vase of roses in my study that the mother of my children threw out because they were dry, dead. When I walk by those roses, I still feel them. And in fact, one of the things that's interesting teaching photography in the Green Hill Cemetery in Greensboro one Saturday, trying to get my students to emotionally connect to the world. I took them to the stump of a tree that had recently been ground, and I had them get down on their knees and feel what was left of the stump. And I said, "So what is that?" And I got back, "Well, it's the stump of a tree." No. And after however many minutes of trying to get them to wrap their heads around it, my comment to them was, "Can you experience the absence of the tree? Can you feel the tree that will never feel another winter?" And part of stillness is not only what's there, but also what's not there. And on Saturday, for example, in some way, I don't know that I'll ever understand, Julia was, but in the experience of Julia being there, Sally wasn't. So if you think about another conversation we had in philosophy, it's 2012. I'm in Paris with JD. We're meeting with our French partners. And at the end of a very long day, I asked them what they thought of our work, and one of them said, I find your work profoundly troubling. And when I asked him why, it came down to, you photograph women who are sad in cemeteries. You photograph dying flowers. He could not understand that beauty and sadness are entwined together all the time. In stillness, that is always true. Every aspect of human emotion is deeply and profoundly there. So when I have to touch the orchid in my study in order to experience purple, I'm experiencing the death of that orchid as well, of that blossom. Other questions so far? These are very helpful. And I wish I could tell you I had more of a prepared lecture for this morning, but I'm still working through.
Okay. I have a question. So, with all the places that you've experienced stillness, are the places significant to you only? Like, are all of them, like, specifically significant to you? Or, actually, it's like three questions. Are they significant? Like, is each one significant, period? And then, are they only significant to you? Or are they also significant to you and another person? Because you said, that you have a significant place with Sally and Nigeria, and so you could feel if they were there or not there. And then also do you have places that are only significant to you that you can still feel still? I mean, do you have places that aren't significant to you prior to, and you still are able to feel stillness there?
Excellent question. And I think the best thing that I can do is to think through this with you. Um, Sometimes that connection, that stillness, involves a single object. For example, in Greensboro at Buffalo Presbyterian Church, I jokingly talk about my favorite tombstone. And by the way, they're not all abandoned churches and tombstones. It's a piece of broken slate And the epithet is literally scratched into the slate. And it says, Margaret Mary Durson, for 34 years in love she lived, and in love she died. Life was requested, but God denied. I can feel that grief. Sometimes it's a person. Example, for a while she was my muse. My friend Gabriel and I went to Comic-Con down in Raleigh, and we were standing there looking for women who could potentially be good models. I could literally feel her across the room. So when we arranged to meet her for coffee to see if she'd be interested in modeling, as we were driving to Durham, Gabriel said, "How will you know her? You've never seen her out of costume." And my comment was, "I'll be able to feel where she was or where she is." And walked into the Panera Bread and walked right over to her and said, "Hello, Sarah." So to some people more than to others, to some objects more than others on a regular basis. But in some cases, I know, because I typically do a lot of work with my son, that my son can feel something like it as well. There are sometimes objects I carry with me, my jewelry on my wrist, my rings, all of which have deep emotional significance. Sometimes it's similar to the poem I've quoted you by Edna St. Vincent Millay, where she can go somewhere and still feel the memory of him there. And I've had the experience of going to a place where she was not and being sadder still. Am I always in the stillness? No. Is it to some extent coloring the way that I live in the world? Probably so. It's disturbing to walk into a classroom and being able to feel the emotional state of most of my students, particularly the ones who are deeply upset about something. Mm-hmm. I don't seem to have a buffer. So again, we're back to, is this a consequence of my eyes? Is this the way that I've internalized a Heideggerian phenomenology? Is it both? I would argue that I am not a disciple of Heidegger. However, I do see the world very much the way he did. I've mentioned this to you before. I had taken Heidegger. I really didn't get it. And that summer, I was sitting reading a book by André Gide. And Gide talks about sitting in the garden, watching the sun come through, the light come through the leaves of the trees around him. And in that moment, I got it. That was the missing piece. As I've said before, if you attempt to understand Heidegger as a philosophical system, you're going to fail. If you attempt to understand it in much the same way that I would understand stillness, then you'll get it. Ashley, you're deep in thought, and I'm not sure where. What's going on? What are you thinking?
I have a question. So like all the things that I was going over, like all the different things you felt, and I was like highlighting them. And so like physically felt, and you talked about like the work, and you talked about the tree. So you touched the bark of the tree. Did it not have leaves? If it did have leaves, why not the leaves? Because I know that you're particularly dark, but you also said that you saw like the light wrapping around the bricks.
That's a profound question, and the answer is I can't tell you. I guess if you think about the way in which that tree is bent, let's see if I have a photo of it in my phone.
And my next question was if it was smooth bark or if it was tough.
It's something about, it's as though it's touching earth and sky. Let me check my gallery. That might be easier. There's the tree. You may need to touch the screen to keep it from going away.
And what was this again?
Old Sheldon Church in South Carolina, not far from US 17. Thank you. So something about the shape of that tree, the way that that tree connects, brings me into the stillness. I subsequently thought about Heidegger's comment about earth touching sky. And in some sense, that's what that tree does. I guess this time that as I said to myself, we're heading over to the tree. It was the first time I thought about the fact that that tree is so central to my experience. I was sliding into the stillness before that point. I uncharacteristically could feel myself slip. I typically don't, but I did. So by the time I got there, I was well into the moment, well into the stillness. I sense another question.
I don't have another question, but I do definitely understand how words you open. And how it like relates to stillness. I mean, that's basically how I can shoot a free throw with my eyes closed. The rhythm, repeated actions.
So in terms of um, I don't know if this is even a question that can be answered. One of the fundamental concepts which we've talked about before that comes from Heidegger is the concept of disclosure. And Heidegger's point is that the world is constantly doing so. The only question is, are we listening, are we open, or are we closed? As I'm talking to you about this, I guess one of my questions would be, if my eyes weren't such a disaster, would I be able to do this anyway? I don't know. I think the fact that Julia made a comment that showed that she clearly understood somehow changed the experience because she was able to be there also. Now, obviously, I'd have to ask her what that was like. But again, to be able to feel anybody, it's kind of funny when I'm when I'm in the stillness and I'm working, for example, with my son, I'll hear something off in the distance. It sounds an eternity away. Yo. And then it gets louder. Yo. And even though he hasn't raised his voice, eventually I'm like, oh, okay. All right. Yes. How can I help? It's also interesting, I noticed this time as well, there's an incredible sense of calm.
So back to our question about like if your mind is running or if it's like simply still as well. Do you think if you're more calm, your thoughts would be more calm, that they aren't logical, they could be emotional. So how does that look like for you?
Also, an interesting question.
Do you feel like you slow down and actually experience the time overlapping upon itself?
I think now that I've been focusing primarily on film, the answer to that is yes. So, to give you an example of how it works, I think I have a photo of my camera so you can get a sense of what that's like. Um, yeah. This is the camera, and it's huge and very heavy. And because it's film, um, when you push the shutter, you have to cock the next shot. So it's not like digital where I can push the shutter down and just go boom, 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 boom. I can't do that. I've got to. And then I'm dealing, my digital camera is pretty heavy too because it's medium format. But this is substantial, substantially heavier. So in some sense, the weight, the fact that it's so primitive, the fact that it forces me to slow down definitely changes the experience. Um, Typically, when I work with digital, I'm moving really quickly and I'm processing information very quickly. When I'm working with film, I'm not. I guess it would be safe to say that I must be thinking something because if I weren't, I would sort of never leave the same spot. At one point, I made a decision to put a filter on the lens, and that was certainly prompted by logic. But for the most part, those are exceptions.
So would you say you were in stillness when you attempted to put both?
Mhm. But again, that sense of calm. It's as though my brain is flatlined. Typically, you both know me well enough to know that I am never without a thought. I'm always processing something. I am not in the stillness. There is just absolutely nothing except whatever emotion I'm feeling at that moment. It also intrigues me that I seem to have more access to memory. For example, if you think about that essay, um, have I recently thought about Sally? Sometime in the past couple of weeks, I asked myself where I thought she might be. I reached out to her 6 or 7 years ago. I thought it was her. I didn't get a response. So, is there some kind of a connection triggered by Julia's experience? I don't know. Are they similar people? Not really. Very different. The only thing they potentially have in common is that they seem to have a sense of who I am. Example, at Yale, in our first semester, we did a paper for Hebrew scripture, and mine was on the prophet Hosea. I gave it to Sally to read. We frequently read each other's papers. I walked into the common room for coffee to meet Sally and said, "So, how are you today?" And she said, "Oh, I'm great. I read an absolutely brilliant paper by a very brilliant person yesterday night." And I said, "Oh, really? What was that?" And she sort of looked at me and she said, "It was your paper." And we hadn't known each other that long, and I was not exactly a terribly outspoken person. And there's a sense, if you think about Julia's comment responding to my wanting to tell her about the stillness, she gets it. Is that the connection? I don't know. Is there something else? I don't know. So, one of the comments that we've made, we said that if we go back to Immanuel Kant, Kant follows up on Descartes. And Descartes' question or comment is, I think, therefore I am. And for Kant, the question becomes, what does it mean to be an I that thinks? We've talked about the fact that Heidegger taught a course on Kant for quite some time. And as I've said before, I think Heidegger's question following on Kant is, what does it mean to be an I? If you recall, we also said that part of what Kant stresses is that objects exist in space and time. Space is the relationship of objects to each other. And time, their relationship to me. Is this the piece that we're talking about? Is somehow what we're calling, or what I'm calling, stillness a function of how I am orienting myself? Or do we go down the more Heideggerian road and argue that the disclosure is always happening? It's just a question of whether we listen or not. So one of the notions Heidegger talks about when he talks about Dasein, the being that is there, between earth and sky, and between birth and death. Heidegger says that Dasein stands open and stands in the light of being. And remember, being with a capital B for Heidegger is nothingness. So is stillness another way of standing open and standing in? Or is stillness another way of responding, or a different way, or a more primordial way of responding to the light of being? Is taking the measure between earth and sky ultimately the paradox of losing oneself and being oneself? I also find it interesting that when stillness is where I am, I typically don't hear. There is just silence. No thoughts. I frequently can listen to music in my head. No music. Nothing. Are you pondering, troubled, thinking?
I'm just thinking about what you said. It's interesting.
Uh-huh.
Confusing, but
Okay. Which part is the most confusing? Not that I'm, let's rephrase that. Please don't assume that I'm not confused.
no, it's not like confusing as in like I have a question confusing. More like it's just like crazy that this can like I don't know, be a part of your daily you know, actions. Do you ever like try? Because I know you said you catch yourself slipping into it, but a lot of times you don't, which means that you don't plan it.
um, when I was at Carolina, I was teaching a class in the business school. And I walked into the classroom one day and walked up to one of my students and I said to her, "Do you need to talk?" It's the same thing when I walk through the student center. I don't consciously do it, but I'm doing it. Can I tell you why it's some people other than others? No, I cannot. Are there times when I wish I could not? Yes. And I guess for me, part of it keeps coming back to the relationship between this experience and my eyes. I know that it's inseparable from my eye problem. It would be fascinating to know if it would be quite the way it is. That incident with Sally happened 4 years before I realized I was in trouble visually. Was I already in part adjusting to a problem I didn't know I had? I don't know. Does it have something to do with being an artist? Is it having studied Heidegger for all these years? I'm less likely to think it has anything to do with that. Can other people do it? That may, in fact, be the essence of art. I don't know. If you were to come with me when I had my camera in my hand, would you experience the same thing that Julia apparently did? Julia was in Richmond. I was quite far away. If it's a different way of being in the world, if it has something to do with this concept of standing open and standing in, then is it something that can be learned? Does it have something to do with what Richardson called authenticity? When I am most myself, am I most standing open and standing in the light of being? Is that what this is all about? I thought it was also interesting that writing that essay, I have not used this phrase since I wrote that backstory. Um, in the spring of that year, which was my last semester, I was taking a class called hermeneutics with Hans Frei. And I did something I had never done before. I wrote my paper and then I attached a postscript. And that postscript began with, and it recounted that scene. So as I was walking away from Old Sheldon Church, I was reading that essay in some shape or form. I don't know why. I don't know what made me write the essay such that I connected it to Julia being there with me. Some of it I can chalk up to nonlinear time, to the fact that in that moment of stillness, past, present, and future are all together. The incident that caused me to shut myself off emotionally for 13 years happened after that incident with Sally. I believe I told you I came home one morning at about 2:30 a.m. after working my fourth job of the day. And when I saw that strand of gray hair in the head of the mother of my children, I could feel her grow old and die. And the pain was so intense that I shut off for 13 years. So, since I know we're beginning to get short on time, what I'd like to see us do between now and the next time is to think about this and to see if there is a correlative to this in your own experience. To think about what you're really thinking versus what you're feeling about the world. Can you feel purple? Can you feel how the brick feels when the sun strikes it. At what point can you be so caught in the experience of the moment that you become so much a part of the moment that you do not exist apart from it? When you think about things past, what does that feel like? Can you go back there and still be here? So if we go back to the essay, as we bring our session to an end, soon the night evens, and I confess that there is a part of me that remains in the darkness that now holds the church in its arms. I am here now in Savannah, and yet am I not. I am there by the tree to the right of the old church, and she is there with me. In that moment when earth touched the sky, when yesterday held tomorrow, and today was a child of both and neither. I am here for the moment before I lose myself again. I long to be in the brickness of the brick, the greenness of the grass, the deepening gray of the afternoon as it passes to night, forever. In the stillness I remember.